Judge insults Pam Bondi. In court, Pam Bondi knew this case was about more than just corruption. But what she didn't know, today it wasn't just the defendant on trial. And you? What would you do if justice was twisted by the very person meant to uphold it? Pam Bondi had seen these games before, but this time was different. The moment she stepped into the courtroom, she felt it. Something was off. A tension, a trap. As if the pieces had been placed before she even arrived. But by who? Judge Howard Gates sat at the bench with an unreadable expression. He leaned over his desk, flipping through a file as if he were reviewing it, but he wasn't. He was stalling, setting the pace. And then, it happened. His eyes lifted to Bondi. His voice was cold, dismissive. "Miss Bondi, please tell me you've actually brought something useful today, or are we just wasting my time?" Silence. The defense attorneys smirked. A few quiet chuckles rippled from the back of the courtroom. The press had their pens ready. Bondi didn't react. She placed her file on the table, her face unreadable. "Your Honor, the evidence will speak for itself. This case is about the misuse of public funds, and my job—" "Ah, yes, of course. Protecting the taxpayers' money. That old routine." Judge Gates sighed, reclining in his chair like he had heard it all before. "I've lost count of how many weak cases like this have wasted this court's time." Bondi's blood boiled, but she didn't let it show. She locked eyes with the judge. "Your Honor, does a government official using taxpayer money to fund luxury projects strike you as a weak case?" The courtroom fell silent, but Gates' expression remained unchanged. "I suppose you're trying to lecture me on law, Bondi." His tone dripped with mockery. "This isn't a classroom. Let's not waste time." The judge leaned back, lacing his fingers together. He let the silence stretch. He controlled the clock. Or so he thought. Bondi tilted her head slightly. Her eyes flickered over Gates' face, and then she saw it. This wasn't just about power. He was afraid. He was hiding something, and Pam Bondi was going to find out what. Pam Bondi exposes Judge Gates. In court, Pam Bondi knew something was off. Judge Gates wasn't just flexing his authority, he was hiding something. But what? She grabbed a file from the table and strode toward the bench, her heels clicking against the cold floor. "Your Honor, I am submitting a document into the court record." Gates raised an eyebrow. He didn't even glance at the file. "Really, Bondi? Is drowning us in paperwork your new strategy?" The defense attorneys chuckled. Bondi didn't flinch. She simply opened the file. "This is the contract between the defendant's company and the city planning board. The official expense is listed as $2 million. Gates' expression remained unreadable, but here's another document. Bondi placed a second page on the desk. "Internal accounting records. The actual spending, $4 million. A few jury members shifted uncomfortably. Bondi wasn't done. She pulled out a third document. "And this," she said, her voice steady, "is the approval signature." She slid the file toward the bench. "Your Honor, who signed this document?" The courtroom froze. Gates' fingers dug into the desk. Finally he spoke. "This document is inadmissible." Bondi tilted her head. "Oh? And why is that?" "It was obtained through improper means." Gates' voice was sharp now. "This document was subpoenaed by my office, Your Honor." Gates' breath hitched. "The process was flawed. I am rejecting this as evidence." The courtroom erupted. Jurors whispered. Reporters scribbled furiously. Bondi's gaze locked onto Gates. "You do realize this is a public case, don't you, Your Honor?" The air in the courtroom grew heavier. A muscle twitched in Gates' jaw. But Bondi wasn't finished. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small recording device. Without a word, she pressed play. And then the words echoed through the courtroom. "Handle it. Do whatever it takes. She can't get those documents." Dead silence. So still, the room felt frozen in time. Gates didn't move. No one did. Because now there was nothing left to hide. Pam Bondi turns the tables in court. The courtroom remained suspended in silence. Pam Bondi studied Judge Gates' blank expression. What would he do now? Deny? Explode in anger? Or simply sit still, hoping to weather the storm? But Gates didn't move. From the defense table, one of the attorneys pushed his chair back. The screech of wood against the floor cut through the tense air like a blade. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice tight, This is obviously a setup." Bondi tilted her head slightly. "A setup? Is this your voice on the recording or not, Judge?" Gates didn't flinch. Then his brow furrowed. "This is ridiculous. You think you can try a case based on an audio clip?" Journalists scribbled furiously. Jurors exchanged glances. Bondi remained calm as she pulled out a file and extended it toward the judge. "This recording was obtained under a federal court order. It's completely legal." Gates' breathing grew shallow. His fingers drummed lightly against the bench. But Bondi's attention shifted. To Charles Lawson, the defendant. His face had gone pale. His fingers gripped the edge of the table tightly. He knew something. Bondi locked eyes with him. "Mr. Lawson, you look a little pale." The defense attorney shot up instantly. "My client is under no obligation to answer these questions." But Lawson was already unraveling. His eyes flickered. Hesitant. Trapped. Then something happened. Lawson leaned forward slightly. His lips parted, but he hesitated. Bondi held her breath. Then, finally, he spoke. If I make a deal, do I get witness protection?" The room exploded. Judge Gates' fingers slammed into the desk. Defense attorneys shouted objections. But it was too late. The pieces were already falling. And Gates, he had nowhere left to run. Pam Bondi leaves Judge Gates with nowhere to run. The chaos in the courtroom refused to settle. Judge Gates sat frozen, his face a mask of stone. His entire career he had sat on that bench as the untouchable authority in the room. But now, all eyes were on him. And the worst part? No one was looking at him with respect anymore. Pam Bondi turned back to Charles Lawson. The defendant sat stiffly at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. His gaze darted away as if looking Bondi in the eyes would confirm the inevitable. "I'll ask you again, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice steady. "Do you want to make a deal?" Lawson blinked rapidly. He hesitated, then took a sharp breath. "If I get witness protection, yes." His defense attorney shot up from his seat. "This is outrageous. My client is being pressured." Bondi turned to him, unshaken. "Mr. Lawson is speaking for himself. Or is it you who doesn't want him to speak?" The attorney froze, but Bondi's focus shifted elsewhere. To Gates. The judge remained seated, but his hands were trembling. He knew what was happening. He knew he was losing control. Then, suddenly, he snapped. Gates stood, slamming his hands against the bench. "This courtroom will return to order. Now," he shouted. For a moment, the room stilled, but no one believed him anymore. Bondi didn't flinch. She calmly gathered her papers, pulled out a document, and turned toward the jury. "I know what you're all thinking right now. Why is Judge Gates so panicked?" Murmurs spread through the courtroom. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Gates' jaw clenched. "You will not turn this court into a spectacle, Bondi." She locked eyes with him. "I'm not the one turning this into a spectacle, Your Honor. You are—" For the first time, Gates looked away. Bondi didn't. She turned back to Lawson. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her tone sharp but inviting, "is there something you'd like to tell us?" Lawson's hands finally unclasped, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom realized Lawson wasn't afraid. Gates was. Lawson inhaled sharply. The contracts, the whole bidding process, it was rigged from the start. The courtroom exploded. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Lawyers whispered in frantic tones. And Judge Gates, he didn't move. Pam Bondi never took her eyes off him. Because now, Gates had nowhere left to run. Pam Bondi delivers the final blow. The air in the courtroom was razor-sharp, slicing through the tension that thickened with every second. Judge Gates remained still, but his once powerful bench no longer looked like a seat of justice. It looked like a defendant's chair. Bondi let the weight of Lawson's words settle in the room. The entire bidding process was rigged from the start. That single sentence was enough to shake the very foundation of the courtroom. Gates slowly leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply, but it wasn't relief. It was the instinct of a man pulling inward, searching for an escape. Bondi shifted her attention to the jury. Some scribbled notes, others stared at Lawson, but there was only one question on everyone's mind. How deep did this go? She took a step closer to Lawson. "Mr. Lawson, start from the beginning. What kind of game was this?" Lawson cleared his throat. The entire project. It was a fraud from day one. The defense attorney shot up. "Objection. My client is being manipulated." Gates turned toward the defense attorney as if looking for an exit, but there was none. Objection overruled. His voice no longer carried the same authority. Lawson continued. The public bidding process never happened. All that mattered was getting Judge Gates' approval. Bondi's eyes narrowed. "And what did you have to do to get that approval?" Lawson hesitated. Then his shoulders dropped. Donations. Big donations. Everyone in the courtroom understood exactly what that meant. Bondi took another step closer. "And where did those donations go, Mr. Lawson?" Lawson glanced away, his jaw tight. "Into secret accounts, controlled by Judge Gates." A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jury members leaned forward, their eyes widening. And Gates? He sat motionless, because he knew the final blow was coming. Bondi didn't look away. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "do you have anything to say about these allegations?" Silence. A silence so heavy it felt like the walls of the courtroom themselves were closing in, because Judge Gates knew. The more he spoke, the deeper he sank. Pam Bondi brings down Judge Gates. The final reckoning. The courtroom was silent, but not the kind of silence that came from waiting. This was the silence of a moment when everything changed. Pam Bondi placed the final document onto the bench. Judge Howard Gates' eyes locked onto it. But he wasn't a judge anymore. He was a man on trial. The jury exchanged glances. Reporters' fingers danced across their phone screens. The air in the room felt held, as if no one dared to breathe. There was nowhere left to run. Gates swallowed hard, but he didn't speak. Then, for the first time, the pressure cracked through. His fingers tapped anxiously against the bench, rapid, uneven, and then he snapped his head up, locking eyes with Bondi. "You can't judge me." Bondi tilted her head. "Can't I?" Gates held his breath. He had one last move left. "These documents are fake. This is a setup." But the jury looked away. No one believed him anymore. His hands clenched the edge of the bench, knuckles white. His nails dug into his palm. But this wasn't anger. This was desperation. The bailiffs stepped forward. 2 officers moved in silently. And then Gates realized. "Judge Howard Gates, you are under arrest for corruption, bribery, and abuse of power." Gates swallowed again, but there was nothing left to defend. The bailiff unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic click echoed through the courtroom. Cameras flashed. Jurors held their breath. Bondi stepped back. This was how it had to end. For a moment, Gates looked at her again, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. The doors swung open, and as Judge Gates was led out of the courtroom, the most powerful man in the room had become nothing more than a prisoner. Then the doors closed, and the game was over. Pam Bondi exhaled deeply. This wasn't just a case. This was a message to the entire system. The mighty can fall, but justice always catches up. What would you have done? If you saw someone this powerful try to outrun justice, how would you respond? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next big takedown. Stay with us as we continue exposing the truth. We'll be back tomorrow. God bless America.